Good morning. My name's Jeb Head, and I've been a member of the Friends of Children Society for the past 5 years. Now, I'm asked to speak about ProKids in a practical way. As you can see, ProKids has an enormously powerful emotional appeal, and that's a really important aspect for many people. But we also want to make sure that we have an objective assessment of the program and how well it works for our community. In assessing this, we should ask a few basic questions. Does ProKids address an urgent moral priority? Does it have a meaningful impact on the key goals of our community? And is ProKids itself effective in both its methods of operation and its execution? Let me start with urgent moral priority. I think we all know that taking care of our own kids is a fundamental and instinctive priority for us. In particular, we know almost without thinking about it that if our own children were in some kind of serious distress or danger, that we would put aside virtually everything and rush to their aid. The question is, does this sense of urgency and this duty of care extend to these neglected and abused kids who are in the dependency system? That's a harder question. They're not literally our children, but the custody of these children has been actually transferred to the county. And by this I mean that the custody is in our community. So, our community appears to have some duty, but is it an urgent priority for us? Still a bit hard to say. I suggest that we take the point of view of one of these children, say a 4-year-old girl, and let's further imagine that we're actually driving her to her next placement. And on the way she asks, "Whose child am I?" Now, we'll still find it hard to give a specific answer, but we can be sure that we don't want to give the response, "You're nobody's child." We want to say something like, "Don't worry, we're going to take care of you. We'll find you a permanent home and a forever family." In saying that, we're making a commitment to this child on the part of our community, and we have to justify it. We're saying that this child is entitled to some form of care from our community. We need to define the entitlement and then compare it to other claims of entitlement within the community to see which should take precedence. This is critical because there's many claims to entitlement in our community, and in many ways our community is already overburdened with entitlements, so unless the one for this child has some kind of priority, we can't make it because it'll never happen. So, for this child, what would we say are her entitlements? First, that we acknowledge that she's innocent, that her situation is by no means her fault. She's not guilty. Second, that we acknowledge that she's dependent, that we never expected her to take care of herself. We didn't imagine she could raise herself. Third, that we acknowledge that she needs a home, a place where there's a basic freedom from violence and pain and from fear and hunger. And finally, that perhaps there's a little compassion, that there would be someone who cares about her being okay, but certainly not that she's in the clutches of a tormentor or victimized by abuse. I think when we frame her entitlement this way, it seems clear that it takes precedence over other claims of entitlement, such that if we were eliminating all but the most critical entitlements, this one would be left as among the most important and the most legitimate. So in this way, I would say that it is an urgent moral priority for us and our community. Next, does it have a significant impact to our community's most cherished goals? Could it be a game changer? In this, I'm reminded of Holly Schlack's great book called Invisible Kids. Holly is on the ProKids staff and writes about her experience in the child welfare system. Her title, Invisible Kids, is accurate. These kids really are invisible in a sense. There are about 2,500 children who are in dependency in Hamilton County at any one time. And outside of those of you here today who are actively working in the system, it's unlikely that any of us are really all that familiar with any of them. How could helping this relatively small number of kids, who are largely out of sight, be a big driver for our community's goals? Maybe it's something we should definitely do and feel good about, but perhaps not likely to have a decisive impact. Well, I would argue that this invisibility is really quite deceiving, because if you think about it again, you'll recognize that these kids will be around for a long time. They're young now, but they grow up and join our community as adults. Let's do the math. On average, the average duration of dependency is about 18 months, which means that 2,500 kids turn over every year and a half or so. That means that every 18 months, another 2,500 kids is added to the overall system, and that builds up. If you look at how many of these kids enter our community as adults over, say, an 18-year period, that comes to about 30,000. Now, that's a big and relevant number, especially considering that our county's population is 800,000. How big and how relevant is it? Well, last year, we told you that nationwide, 80% of inmates in the prison population have at some time been in the foster care system. So that roughly means that 80% of prison inmates suffered from neglect and abuse as kids. At that time, it seemed like a powerful statistic, but kind of hard to believe. How could something as vast as crime itself, one of our community's most difficult and intractable problems, be coming in such large measure from just this one source? Well, it's true. By continually adding the neglected and abused to our community, you're actually manufacturing the prison population. Neglect and abuse is the dominant feeder system for our community's most costly and painful problems. And we can be sure that as it is with crime, so it is with drug abuse, domestic violence, teen pregnancy, and poverty in general. And what did we expect? Didn't we say that children can't raise themselves? But if we could change this, if we could reach in and address this, we would find it's potentially the biggest leverage point we have in terms of moving our community toward a brighter future. So it is a big thing. But can we do that? Can we reach in and fix it? How much does a CASA program like ProKids help? The answer is a lot. Nationwide, CASA programs have proven themselves over the past 30 years. The concept was originated in the 70s, and by 1980, there were 80 programs throughout the country. That number grew to 600 in 1995 and over 1,000 today. The proliferation of these programs is evidence in itself that they work. But beyond this, as the programs have grown, juvenile court judges have become outspoken advocates and have actively called for more CASAs and more CASA programs because they are so effective. It seems intuitively clear that you need something like this, the direct intervention by a human individual who is pursuing nothing but the child's best interest. For these little kids to have a CASA approach them and say, I care about you, I want what's best for you, I believe in your future, and I'm going to stand by you. That's exactly what we wanted to say to these children. And that might be the first time that child has ever heard something like that from an adult who means it. And in Hamilton County, we don't just have a CASA program. We have ProKids. ProKids is one of the best CASA programs in the nation, and it's in the forefront in terms of innovation, commitment, and the professionalism of its staff and the breadth and expertise of its volunteers. So it is a compelling moral priority. It is a critical leverage point for achieving our community's goals, and the method and team that we have is proven and exceptional. This is something that we can bet on, and indeed our community is responding. ProKids continues to grow both in terms of donors and volunteers, thanks to many of you here today. And we're making huge strides toward the goal of covering every dependent child. We're not there yet, but many hands make light work, and there will be a day when we will cover the last kid who doesn't have a CASA. Thank you. Now I'm also going to introduce Quatez Scott. So speaking of committed and passionate people, let's talk about Quatez Scott. Some of you may be familiar with Quatez and his story, either by hearing him speak at this breakfast a few years back, reading about him in the Cincinnati Enquirer, or talking with any staff member at ProKids. He's a remarkable young man that has been on quite a journey in his young life. Quatez had a chaotic childhood marked by years of neglect and abuse. His mother abused drugs and left Quatez to fend for himself. Quatez was brutally abused for years at the hands of his father. Quatez moved from foster homes to crisis centers to group homes, 24 in all. His anger festered and frequently boiled over. When Quatez was 11, he met Kathy King from ProKids. She remembers what an angry boy he was and was deeply concerned about the destructive path he was on. She says, for traumatized children, normal reactions are to fight back and to try to protect themselves, their feelings, and push people away. That's exactly what Cortez did. With Kathy's tireless advocacy, she built a support system around Cortez that helped him to not only survive, but flourish. He persevered and was determined to change his path. Just days ago, the 23-year-old graduated from Wilmington College with a bachelor's degree in communication arts. At a time when only 50% of foster children graduate from high school and a mere 3% from college, Cortez acts as a shining example of what's possible and what we can hope for all dependent children.